We're going to deal with King Herod. Now, we've heard about King Herod when Jesus was born, and then we heard about King Herod with John the Baptist, and now we have King Herod now. Um, are they all the same guy? No, it's different people. So I thought it'd be helpful for you to have a little bit of a history lesson. So we're going to go through these different men that were in the lineage of as King Herod so that we can kind of have the context of who we are dealing with right now. All right. Now we're going to read about here in Acts 12 that King Herod is killed, James the apostle is killed, and Peter is imprisoned. Now let's talk about the lineage of Herod. Okay, so Herod the Great, he was the Herod during the times of Jesus. His father was Herod Antipater. And then what's interesting is this whole lineage of Herods were from the heritage of Esau. We have Esau and Jacob, and so they were descendants of Esau. And then this whole lineage, these are the ones that built Masada. I've been there, pretty profound experience. And then the temple. Instead of getting the temple that you hear about in Ezekiel, they got the temple of Herod. So the Ezekiel's temple has never been built. And I could go into a debate whether it ever will be, but that's not what we're studying right now. So this Herod the Great killed many of his wives and his sons. And when he was close to death, he imprisoned the upper class citizens and had them executed upon their death so that there would be mourning in the land. He knew he was hated. Nobody was going to be grieving his death. So he killed all these upper class citizens so that people would be grieving somebody when he was passing. Pretty twisted, huh? Now, what's interesting, let's walk through, some of his children that he killed and his wives that he killed. Herod Philip was the first husband of Herodias. Now, Herodias, she left Herod Philip for his brother, Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas is the one who ended up executing John the Baptist because now his new wife, who left Herod Antipas's brother, Herod Philip, for Herod Antipas was Herodias, and she wanted John the Baptist killed. Now, after Herod Antipas, you had Herod Archelaus. He was deposed and replaced with Herod Philip II. And Herod Philip II built Caesarea Philippi. And Herod Agrippa I is the son of Aristobulus, who was the son of Herod the Great, who killed Agrippa's father, Aristobulus. So, this is a real loving family, as you can see. This is the Herod we read about here in Acts 12, Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa II is the one that Paul stands trial with later on. So with that history lesson, let's dive in. Verse 1 of chapter 12, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So now we know James is the first martyr among the apostles, second martyr overall, because the first martyr was Stephen. Herod actually valued Jewish traditions and looked to get along with the Jews. So that's why he was eager to seize Peter, because when he saw, verse 3, that it pleased the Jews that he killed James, then he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now, this was during the days of unleavened bread, which we know is Passover. Verse 4, and when he seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. Now, this is just fun little details I like to pull out. So 4 squads of soldiers were 16 soldiers. 16 soldiers in 4 squads. 2 were chained to the prisoner, and 2 were standing guard and would change out every 6 hours. See, because they're remembering the escape via an angel earlier on in the book of Acts. So it's like, we're going to make sure this guy doesn't get away, because there was severe punishment for failure to do what the king asked. Verse 5, so Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Now, that's something I want to camp out on a little bit. Earnest or consistent prayer was made for him to God by the church. Now, this is one of the questions most people would ask. Oh, great. So they didn't pray for James, they only prayed for Peter. Well, that's not necessarily true. But why did James have to die? Well, remember that prayer, whether it's constant prayer, earnest prayer, it is a prayer of agreement with the will of God, not to get God to change his mind or to sway him or to, influence him like you're more earnest and desirous of the things of God than God is. Now, come on. So here's the reality of it. If you go back, if you remember the passage where James and John's mother asked Jesus about the status of her sons, and he said, are you able to drink from this cup? Which he was talking about his execution, his crucifixion. And they said, yes, we are able to drink of the cup. And then he says, you are going to drink from this cup. And so this is actually a fulfillment of that prediction that Christ made when James and John's mother came to him. Constant prayer or earnest prayer is very intentional prayer to really find God's heart in agreement for something. And in Peter's case, and we also know this from a prediction earlier, Peter had comfort because Jesus said how he's going to die when he was old, and he's not old yet. So he knew he wasn't going to die. So now, verse 6, when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping. I'm going to get executed in the morning. He was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison, just as I laid out earlier on the 4 squads. Sleeping when you're about to get executed. But again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, John 21 is when Jesus said, when you are old. So he knew. He leaned on the promises of God. He knew he wasn't going to die. Verse 7. So he predicted James's death, and he predicted Peter would not die. And so their prayers were in agreement with the will of God that was planned out from beforehand. So verse 7, and behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. And the angel struck Peter on the side and woke him up. Get up quickly. And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, dress yourself and put on your sandals. And he did so. And the angel said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. And he went out and followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real. He thought it was all in a vision. And I know what that's like. I've had that happen, where you think you're in a dream state, but you're not. Many times, the spiritual realm can seem more real than the natural realm. If you let it, I find it amusing that the angel hit and struck him to wake him up. We think we got to do something to see angels. No, they had to do something so we would see them, because we weren't paying attention. We were sleeping, in the case of Peter. But here's the key point I want to say with this. We don't need to create an environment for God to move. He moves us when needed. So it wasn't because, Peter was really in an expected place of faith that God rescued him. It's because it was God's will. and the prayers of the saints were in agreement this time with what God wanted to do to spare Peter's life. So I hope that will create some discussion we can talk about later. Verse 10, when they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. This is the angel leading Peter out. It opened for them on its own accord. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. Angels are messengers and servants. And the angel rescued Peter. The prayers of the saints summoned the angel because there's an agreement with the purposes of God. Verse 11, when Peter came to him, he said, I got to read that differently correctly. When Peter came to himself, no longer thinking in a dream state, he said, now I am sure that the Lord has sent this angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people were expecting. So let me explain what that means. He woke up and realized not only did God rescue him from this situation, but God rescued him from the opinions of the masses. All these people that were angry and stirred up because they're just following the crowd, those no longer moved him. Remember, when the masses were want to crucify Jesus, he was swayed by the masses, denying Jesus 3 times. So here, the Jewish people were not swaying him any longer. So he was rescued from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. He was only moved by what God was telling him at this point. The Holy Spirit gave him boldness in the beginning of the book of Acts. And now we see him fully focused on following the heart of God and doing what he sees the Father doing. I think that's an important point to make there. Now, verse 12, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary. That's the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. So this isn't the Apostle John. This is John Mark. And it's a different Mary, where many were gathered together and were praying. John Mark's home traditionally has been noted as the headquarters of the Jerusalem church. So this is probably the author of the Gospel of Mark, as we can best ascertain. In verse 13, and when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. So here's an interesting point. This is the same group. Okay, so I just finished with verse 14. This is the same group that had been earnestly, consistently praying for Peter to be rescued. All right? This is that group. Now, our mindset is, well, they've got to have the faith of, the faith of the mustard seed. Well, yeah, what does that mean? Because they had faith. They were earnestly praying for Peter to be rescued. But when she told him that he had been rescued, and they responded this way. She basically said, Peter's at the gate. Our prayers have been answered, basically is what she's saying. And here's their response. You are out of your mind. So they weren't in this place of expectation. Well, I have faith and I'm expecting God's miracle. That's not where their alignment was. Their alignment was, we earnestly are petitioning God to rescue Peter because we love him. And when he had his prayer answered, well, they had their prayer answered. They said, you're out of your mind. But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept trying to figure out justification. Well, the scriptures, and they kept saying, it is his angel. Well, there was an angel involved, for sure. But this mustard seed theology doesn't require expectation, but authenticity and a desire to agree. Now, a key thing that Ryan said recently is, because this is one of his favorite verses on the mustard seed theology, and the faith of the mustard seed is really, really small. So it's saying you don't need much faith. But the other thing that we have to start removing, okay, we have the faith of a mustard seed, but do we have unbelief? Do we have doubt? And to start removing that doubt that keeps us moving those things that compromise our convictions, those things that we put up with and live with that actually muddy the waters as far as us agreeing with what the Spirit is doing. Now, having said all that, they doubted. Little Rhoda said he's outside. They didn't believe a word of it. But then verse 16, Peter continued knocking. And when they finally opened it, they saw him and were amazed. So here's where the thing is. They saw it. When they saw it with their own eyes, then they received it and celebrated it. They didn't deny it any longer. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, tell these things to James and to the brothers. And then he departed and went to another place. We later on see that it was Caesarea. Now, we got to look at, okay, he said, tell James. Well, James was just killed. So there's another James going on here, right? Which is Jesus' brother. No little disturbance is the phrase that we see next in verse 18. Now, when the day came, when daylight came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. Basically, what no little disturbance means is absolute panic was taking place because the failure of guarding Peter meant a death sentence for everybody. Verse 19, and after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries, the guards, and ordered that they should be put to death. Now he, Peter, went down, as I mentioned earlier, from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. Now let's go into verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. This is kind of like a side note. So it's kind of a little bit of diversion from what was just being told, but it's kind of encapsulating what ended up of Herod. He was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, unified, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat on the throne. This would be in Caesarea, in the theater there in Caesarea for Claudius. And he delivered an oration to them. And I know they were trying to kiss up. They were doing whatever they needed to. The people were shouting the voice of a God and not of a man. Verse 22. Verse 23, immediately an angel of the Lord struck Herod down because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. So the key thing is, and this is something I say as a statement, a statue cannot erect itself. Even in ministry, there's people that'll lift you up because God uses you or does things with you. And if you receive it in an act as a focus of idolatry or worship, we're in dangerous ground. We need to know it's the Lord's work and all that we do, right? And here they're saying the voice of a God, not of a man. And Herod received it. Herod said, yeah, keep going. And since he did not give God glory, he was eaten by worms. This was actually mentioned historically by the Jewish historian Josephus, who worked for the Romans. He mentions this and confirms this was on the second day of a feast in Caesarea for Claudius. And Herod was struck. He suffered for 5 days before he died. And that continues on to close out the chapter. But the word of God increased and multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name is John Mark, which we talked about. They're staying at his house in Jerusalem. That was kind of the headquarters of the church in Jerusalem, but he was now coming to them as they're working in this area. And so we're seeing now that the leadership of the church is expanded outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's no longer the epicenter. And we're going to see the massive shift now coming into chapter 13, where it's pretty much exclusively the missionary journeys of Paul. So we see, in Acts 11, Barnabas went to go find Saul, who was in Tarsus, and then they went to Jerusalem and re-engaged with leadership. And now we're seeing this transition. So you're not going to hear about Peter hardly at all anymore. And you're going to see it all be about what Paul did to expand the early church into the uttermost parts of the world. So we had Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. So Jerusalem was, right after the crucifixion and, Acts 2. And then we see after Stephen's death and then the vision with unclean animals, it went to the Gentiles, and now it's going out, where we're going to see Paul go to Rome and create many church plants in his missionary journeys. And we're going to be digging into that starting next time. So I wish we could dialogue about it right now, but let's start with that when we get together before we start chapter 13. God bless you. We'll see you soon.